Of course, it was hard to hide his frustration after having to contend with that obviously malfunctioning escalator and also a broken teleprompter during this initial meeting there with the different world leaders, because he arrived at the United Nations and on his way up from the escalator on that lobby area to the second floor, it stopped as soon as he and First Lady Melania Trump stepped onto it, and then immediately the teleprompter failed when he began to deliver his remarks, potentially souring this speech. Let's be joined right now here by New York Times reporter Luke Broadwater. Luke, thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. And President Trump had a lot to say, a lot to speak on his mind, and he went off script several times. What did we hear? What were the big takeaways for you?
Sure. Well, perhaps the president came in a little bit of a sour mood after the malfunctioning escalator and then the teleprompter not working. And, you know, speaking with some White House officials, they believe that these weren't accidents, that this was perhaps someone at the UN was trying to mess with him or sabotage. And, you know, Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, just put out a statement saying they're going to be looking into this. And if someone did this on purpose, that they should be punished in some way. But we'll get to the meat of this speech. It was an incredibly long speech. You know, speakers at the UN are supposed to speak for no more than 15 minutes. There's world leaders from around the world who are all supposed to get in their 15 minutes, have their say. President Trump blew through that time limit. He went, by my count, 56 minutes, so almost 4 times the allotted amount. Maybe part of that is due to the teleprompter malfunctioning and him going off script, but he went through a litany of complaints with the United Nations. He said all they do is send letters. They send strongly worded statements. They're not out there actually trying to solve the world's conflicts or solve different wars. He credited himself with several peace agreements, and he said that basically he had to do these on his own and that the UN was nowhere to be found. It wasn't helpful. And as you know, President Trump has been cutting the amount of aid that's going to the UN or the amount of funding going to the UN. And I think he's making the case that the UN doesn't deserve the amount of funding that the United States has been giving it. And so that was one of the big messages that he delivered. Another one was he really laid into the UN about climate change. He said climate change is a hoax, that, you know, basically it's been it's a fraud perpetrated on rich countries. And, you know, I think a lot of climate scientists would disagree with his conclusions there, but he lectured the United Nations for at least 10 minutes on the subject of climate change, and then many of his pet peeves. You know, he's long hated windmills. He talked, of course, about how much he hates windmills and similar issues. But I would say the real news out of today came after the speech, and that's when President Trump put out this statement after meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine and Ursula von der Leyen of the European Union, that he believed Ukraine can win back the territories that Russia took from Ukraine. That's a new statement for President Trump. In the past, he has basically conceded certain lands to Russia, saying that Ukraine was going to have to learn to live with reality and give back and concede those lands to Russia. But he's changed his view on the success of Ukraine, and I think it is after those meetings and hearing, you know, new evidence of what's actually happening on the ground in Ukraine.
Yeah, that's a point we're going to get to in just a little bit, but you kind of summed it up very well, because there was just so many things to get to. Obviously, him saying that he was potentially sabotaged, that some of these things going wrong were not just coincidence. I do want to ask you kind of about this, because this is the first time he's addressed the UN in his second term, and in previous terms he's spoken and some of these things. He's gotten the ire of the United Nations, saying they didn't live up to their potential. Some of these empty words. What was the reaction from different world leaders? In years past, they may have laughed at some of these things. They potentially took it more serious this time. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I would say it was mostly polite deference. In the past, as you rightly note, when President Trump made some of these grandiose statements in his first term at the UN, he was literally laughed at. They laughed at him. And this time, nobody was laughing. At the end, there was polite applause for his speech, even though he basically said, I mean, he gave blanket condemnations to much of the world. He said, you're turning your countries into hell, right? He said, you're ruining your countries through immigration. He said, I know how to run a country and you guys don't, essentially. And he said he's been right about everything. So it was a very, it almost felt like a lecture and a condemnation of many of the other countries in the world, even some of our allies, right? Even some of longstanding American allies. He took issue with the position of the United Kingdom and of France to declare, and other allies, Canada, Australia, to declare a Palestinian state, to recognize a Palestinian state. He said that was harmful to the cause of peace in Israel and with the war in Gaza. So there were very few kind words for those seated out in the audience. I mean, he talked bad about Brazil, right? I mean, you could list off a long list of countries that sort of caught the president's ire. But afterwards, they were lining up to meet with him one-on-one. It was world leader after world leader trying to get one-on-ones with President Trump. And I think they were more effective in those one-on-ones, as we saw with the development with Ukraine. That was, and people who know President Trump know he's often very nice in person. If you can get him one-on-one, the last person to talk to him, these world leaders understand, they can make their case one-to-one. Now, if he's in a group setting, he's got the cameras on him, he may be more bombastic and confrontational. And we certainly saw that side of the president as well earlier in his speech.
Yeah, and I wanted to kind of get into that because the theater of it all, the forum in which he speaks at this United Nations General Assembly, we saw it in years past, dating back to almost 2018 when he last spoke. He called the leader of North Korea Rocket Man. We saw kind of those kind of speeches. So it's interesting that, you know, like I was going to, that the tone definitely shifts when it's more of a one-on-one meeting with Zelensky immediately after. A lot was accomplished in that way, and he kind of reeled back some of the comments about the United Nations, saying this is a great body, that they want to work together in such a way. Was more accomplished after the fact, after this speech?
100%. I mean, the speech this morning, perhaps it was a shot across the bow. It was a statement that I'm displeased with many of the other world leaders. But then one by one, they come to him, they make their case. He's very friendly, he's accommodating. I've actually never heard him be as nice and as complimentary of Ukraine as he was today. I mean, he was going out of his way to have Zelensky almost boast about how successful Ukraine has been on the battlefield. He talked about the toughness of Ukraine and the resolve of Ukraine. It was, you know, it's night and day from only several months ago when Zelensky was in the Oval Office and he got dressed down by both President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance. I mean, it was a complete flip of that situation. So, and there was no talk about meeting again with Russia and a peace deal where Ukrainian lands will be given over to Russia. In fact, Marco Rubio was just at the Security Council talking about military options should Russia not come to heel. So, you know, this is a very big flip in policy for the United States government coming out of these meetings today at the UN.
Yeah, and those meetings, like you mentioned, Zelensky is the one I want to talk about because you mentioned it. That was the big development today, and this was the meeting between Trump and Zelensky kind of on the sidelines, a bilateral of these two leaders there. And, of course, we heard from President Trump on social media the claims that obviously Ukraine can win some of those territory back there in Ukraine following a 3.5-year war with it. How much is the United States now backing? How much of a flip is it? Is it a complete 180 because President Trump has touted his friendship with Russian leader Vladimir Putin and now saying that unfortunately it doesn't go as far? That relationship, that bond didn't really mean as much to him. How much of a shift could it be, and what are we expecting next in terms of that? Because now we'll know what Russia and the world leaders are talking about. What do you expect next?
Well, it is a big shift, and but it's been happening slowly over time, right? We've heard President Trump now repeatedly talk about his increasing frustration with Putin, that he thought at first that his friendship with Putin would produce results, and then he felt he was being tapped along. And he even has mentioned that his wife, Melania Trump, has noticed it, that he'll have a great call with Putin, and he'll hang up the phone, and she'll turn on TV and notice that he's bombing a Ukrainian city right after he had this talk about peace with President Trump on the phone. And so he started to feel that perhaps Putin was being duplicitous with him. But I do think the one development that perhaps went slightly unnoticed is in the meeting with Ursula von der Leyen of the European Commission. She 100% adopted President Trump's position that the European countries should not buy Russian oil or gas, which President Trump has maintained is helping to fuel the Russian war. And she was categorical in that they shouldn't do it anymore and that they were winding it down. And I do think that Trump thinks a lot in business terms and in import and export terms. And the idea that both NATO is going to buy American weapons to help Ukraine fight Russia, and now European countries are no longer going to be buying oil or gas from Russia and perhaps looking to other countries, maybe even the United States, one of the great producers of oil in the world, to have more economic might coming from America to Europe. You could see how that somewhat incentivizes him from a business perspective, that Ukraine is really the side that he should throw his full weight behind, and Europe is the side, and not his old friend Putin and Russia.
Yeah, and he continues to say, kind of check back in several weeks, and they have fortunately, potentially kind of met the end of that deadline. We're almost 4 years into this conflict there, and obviously sanctions, you mentioned, the kind of the arsenal, the weaponry that can be allowed to go to Ukraine. Does this mean we're closer to potentially U.S. involvement, boots on the ground? Do we get any insinuation of that?
Yeah, so President Trump throughout his presidency has always been very reluctant to put boots on the ground. I mean, he's very, very clear about that. That said, we have seen him take military action quickly with regards to Iran, right? So he will do a strike. He will do a sudden flash of military action. We haven't seen much appetite for boots on the ground, but he's all too happy to allow Europe to buy American-made weapons to support Ukraine. He views that as a good thing for Ukraine and also a good thing for American companies.
All right, very good. Luke, thank you so much for joining us. Anything we're missing? There were just so many different pockets of headlines, like you mentioned. Anything else that you want to know before I let you go?
I mean, the speech had really, there are probably 100 storylines out of that speech, depending on what issue you're most interested in. But I think we hit the biggest ones.
All right, very good. I just wanted to touch base with you. Thank you so much. I appreciate your reporting. I know you're going to stay busy with all of these headlines. Thanks again here for joining us.
Thank you.
All right.